So welcome again. So we are on the third day of the conference. The third one, but not the less important. We still have a lot to fulfill and to achieve today. Hope everyone is fine and that you enjoyed yesterday. Yesterday I think we had a full day with a lot of things that were happening between plenaries and parallel sessions. Actually, we started digging deeper into conversations. In particular, yesterday afternoon, I saw that there was a lot going on, and we were also leaving the venue a little bit later than scheduled, but I think that was good, and that this was like allowing us to put the basis for what is happening today. So this morning, we are gonna follow the same format we had foreseen for yesterday. So we are gonna have again a plenary session. So we are gonna invite again on stage 3 speakers, and the session will be moderated by the International Labour Organization. And as you can see on screen and from the program, the plenary session is going to tackle the third thematic block of the foreseen for the conference. So we are going to see together the role of financial resources in support of SSE. Then after the plenary, we are going to divide again into 3 parallel tracks. Then we will make sure that there will be a moment also for a group picture. So I will give instruction for that. So make sure that you are going to be there, because we want everyone to be in the group picture as well for the follow-up report of the event. And finally, be ready for the afternoon. Afternoon session is not going to be anymore about plenary and parallel, but we're going to have a final group work session. So we have to make sure that we converge all the inputs that we raised throughout the different discussions happening yesterday and this morning, and we have to make sure that we extract the right ingredients for the recommendation, for the formulation of recommendations on policy and research. So this will be the objective of the afternoon. Before moving on, I just have a logistical thing. Someone gave me this, maybe someone lost it on the bus. I just wanted to point it out that there is a missing item. I'm gonna give it to Gloria, so in case someone have missed this, please take care of it. It was on the bus. Yes, exactly. So it's with Gloria. So let's see, we can start. I think we are all here. Okay, so I'm gonna ask Roberto Di Meglio, senior specialist at ILO for Social and Solidarity Economy, to join me on stage and introduce the speakers of this session. I will be helping with the setup of the presentations, and then there will be a Q&A session moderated by Roberto, and we will make sure that this happens as smooth as way as possible. Roberto, over to you.
Thank you, Alessia. I am going to speak in Italian. We don't see many Italians, but I take this opportunity to speak in my language. Well, we will start with this panel. This panel is the last plenary on supporting the SSE, the role of financial resources. La dichiarazione dell'Organizzazione Internazionale del Lavoro di quest'anno, che è stata adottata quest'anno nella conferenza internazionale di giugno, ha indicato che l'economia sociale e solidale è uno degli elementi a tenere in conto da parte dei governi, dei Paesi membri e della OIL, a tenere in conto per promuovere il lavoro dignitoso, per creare il lavoro dignitoso. Il rapporto della Commissione sul futuro del lavoro, la Commissione di alto livello, che è stato presentato a gennaio di quest'anno, ha indicato la necessità che ci sia una nuova agenda sociale, che questa nuova agenda sociale sia centrata sul fattore umano. Ecco, questa indicazione per noi significa dare importanza al fattore umano, significa l'importanza che ha tenere in conto il territorio, e quando teniamo in conto il territorio l'economia sociale e solidale può giocare un ruolo importante. Dico questo perché noi siamo qui per approfondire un argomento, quello dei meccanismi finanziari, della finanza per l'economia sociale. Siamo qui per sviluppare, per essere più consapevoli, più informati, per convincere i policy makers della necessità di politiche più inclusive, più sostenibili. I problemi del mondo attuale, che sono, li sappiamo, la diseguaglianza, la mancanza di lavoro dignitoso, la contaminazione ambientale, richiedono nuovi modelli di produzione e consumo, impongono, direi, nuovi modelli di produzione e consumo. Ecco, noi pensiamo che l'economia sociale e solidale sia un elemento importante a tenere in conto per queste nuove politiche, ma per fare ciò dobbiamo convincere non noi stessi, che in questa sala penso siamo tutti abbastanza convinti della bontà dell'economia sociale e solidale, ma andare fuori e convertire i non credenti in modo che sviluppino, disegnino, implementino politiche più inclusive e più democratiche. Tutto questo evitando, diciamo, ne parlavo ieri con la rappresentante, la collega che lavora in Sudafrica, sulla necessità di politiche di Stato che comunque lasciano autonomia all'economia sociale e solidale, così come ne parlavo con il professore all'università in Colombia, Juan Fernando, che non vedo qui, sulla necessità di promuovere l'economia sociale in un paese come la Colombia, dove la necessità di coesione sociale è importante per via del conflitto, e dove l'economia sociale può giocare un ruolo importante. Per tornare al discorso del convincere, uno degli aspetti importanti del convincere è avere argomenti rispetto a quegli aspetti dell'economia sociale che richiedono interventi di politica, politiche che possono essere in senso ampio, riguardanti le definizioni, le leggi, politiche che possono riguardare direttamente l'economia sociale e solidale, e politiche che possono riguardare i settori dove l'economia sociale e solidale lavora. Ecco, qua stiamo parlando di approfondire un argomento quale quello dei aspetti relativi alla finanza, che puntano direttamente alle organizzazioni, alle imprese dell'economia sociale. E io ho il piacere di avere 3 panelisti qua oggi. Il primo che invito a venire a parlare è Gianluca Salvatori, che è segretario generale di Eurixe, è membro del GECES, il gruppo di esperti della Commissione europea, è stato assessore all'innovazione della provincia di Trento, che ci parlerà di meccanismi finanziari per l'economia sociale più tradizionali. Gianluca, la parola a te.
Grazie Roberto, and thank you to Roberto, and thank you to you all for this opportunity to present this piece of research that we have done in RICS with ILO, with the support of the Luxembourg government, and with some of our colleagues that are among us today. You will find a report, the full report in a few days. No, I think is already downloadable on the website of the ILO, on the website of the conference, and on the website of the RICSE. But you will find a printed copy of the executive summary at the entrance, so maybe you have already that. And so you know more or less what is the report about. My role this morning is to give you some basic ideas of the arguments that you can find in this report. Of course, I will try to simplify. The report is quite articulated and complex, and so I would like to point out some of the main findings that we wanted to discuss with you. The research question at the center of our work was the kind of financial resources that social and solidarity economy needs, and how these resources are available to the organization, but also for what purpose they are being used. And the three themes are strongly interconnected. We don't need just to know if there is a need for financial resources. We do need to understand better, to go deeper into the kind of use by the organizations of these resources, because this changed the picture. The report has three main stages. The first one was an overview of the main financial sources and the main mechanism. Second one was the structure of the ecosystem. You already heard something yesterday in the second plenary about the fundamental importance of ecosystem for the development of the social and solidarity economy. And then the analysis of some cross-cutting theme and some recommendation that we do suggest according to our studies. The finding zero, the basic finding, is that we do lack of reliable data, as you already know. This is, a very common theme that we find not just analyzing the financial resources, but all aspects related to the social and solidarity economy. And this is reflected also in the kind of perimeter that we use for our research. The SSE population is under investigation. What you see here is an extract of a document of the United Nations reflecting the work that has been done on the satellite accounts with a UN handbook on that. And as maybe most of you already know, this is a kind of picture that is not fully satisfactory. We are not fully happy with this kind of combination of different elements. We do know that it doesn't reflect exactly the reality what we know, because it's quite diverse. It's a reality that is marked by plurality. And so, for instance, the role of the non-profit organization within the perimeter must be discussed. The split that you can see here between social enterprise and the legal forms is not fully correct. There are a lot of things to be discussed in that. And I want to start from here, because the SSE population is, of course, a basic issue that we have to face if we want to draw significant and effective policy suggestions. A basic assumption of our work is that we are talking about enterprises. SSE organization are organizations that are producing goods and services, like any other kind of enterprise. So we have not to speak about profit or non-profit. We are speaking about enterprises, companies producing profit that has to be allocated in a way that is different from an organization maximizing profit. So the difference is in the way the profit is allocated. So in terms of financial resources, the organization of the social and solidarity economy are not different from a traditional organization. They have the same needs. They need to grow up, they need to respond to new demands coming from the market. They have to make the organization more stable, to answer to more needs. I mean, from this side of the analysis, we do have organizations that are absolutely similar to ordinary organizations. What is different is the kind of finance that you can access being an organization of the social and solidarity economy. Because you have different value, principles, but also different restraints, different limits. And of course, the way you can or you cannot retribute the investors is a main difference between the two families and the two kind of companies, organizations. So what I want to stress here is that we have to focus not on needs, but more on the kind of finance that can be accessed and how. Which are the specificity of this word, of the social and solidarity economy? The main specificity is that you cannot attract investors, remunerating the investors in the same way of a traditional for capital, for profit organization. So the kind of financial resources available are conditioned by this element. So this has done in the history, this has created a shift in the social and solidarity economy organization towards internal forms of capitalization. And this is something distinctive. This is something that makes the difference between these kind of companies and other for-profit companies. So there has been a kind of obligation in looking for different tools and different instruments and creating their own instruments, because access to ordinary instruments was more difficult. So what we did in our study was classifying the demand according to the different types of subjects. So we do have the subjects that now are within the concept, the large concept of SSE. So we have associations, foundations, cooperatives, mutuals, and other non-for-profit kind of organizations, social enterprises, and so on. On the other side, we do have this supply made by different kind of sources. Philanthropic sources, member sources, sources made available by financial intermediaries and institutions, public sector and grant sources. So we do have two taxonomies that are quite diverse and complex. And we try to see how the two taxonomies can dialogue, which are the financial mechanisms that can be combined according to the specific need of the specific organization. So what we have done was an analysis taking into account the characters and the specificity of each instrument and of each organization, and trying to see the financial mechanism in an order that gives more priority to some tools instead of other. Internal financing tools, as you see in our list, is number one. and then grants, finance, equity, and mixed tools. And this kind, of list gives you an overall, an idea, general idea, what was one of the main findings in terms of priority of these different instruments. Another finding from our research is that tools and instruments are adapted to single phases or stages of the development. In this world, you have organizations that can be very different in terms of stages of growth. A social startup that is moving the first steps, just beginning its operation on very limited resources, looking for capital, starting capital, of course cannot be compared with a mature and strongly capitalized cooperative, like an agricultural cooperative like this one, that has its own asset, its own financial stability, that can give an easy access to credit. They are two subjects completely different in terms of needs. A social enterprise working on work integration, job integration, providing, for instance, gardening services, has a little to do with a foundation managing a large hospital with thousands of employees, and with a need of having a financial stability for decades. So, all these different organizations are within the perimeter, are within the world that we are investigating. So we had to go through the different stages trying to understand which instrument is better for which phase. At the development phase, when you start up a new organization, of course you need more capital from outside, more instruments that give you the strength in order to experiment and prototype your new endeavor. When you are in the middle of your life, you can access traditional instruments like loans. You can have participation in terms of equities. You have a stable reputation. You have a trust that you can spend in obtaining resources from third parties, traditional or non-traditional third parties. And growing up, when you have many years at your back, you have more than 1 century like this binary, you have the strength, the financial strength, to base your development on your own instruments. So you can, in a way, negotiate the way of funding funds according to your needs from a position that is stronger than at the beginning of a new experience. The same representation can be found in a different way, but the kind of information that are there are almost the same. We have to take into account stages, instruments, and kind of organizations, and mixing that up in order to combine them in an effective way in a specific instant of the growth path. So this was the general, general ideas from where we started, and some specific points of the research that I want to resume here are first the idea of a kind of organization, a kind of ecosystem that is way beyond marginality. We are thinking about organizations that are a significant part of our economy. We heard yesterday and the day before some figures about some countries, those that have statistical information. In some cases, we are talking about the 10%, 15%, 8% of the GDP, national GDP. And the same for the rate of employment that is high, between 8 and 10, 12. So they are not the margins of the economy. They are becoming a pillar of the social and economic development of our countries. And they are not more on specific areas or domains, like non-market services, social services, healthcare, but they are spreading in many other fields because of a different attitude in terms of providing services by the state that is under stress in terms of finance, but also in terms of understanding of the new needs. The rate of development of the public policy cannot follow exactly the change of society. They have a delay in reacting to new needs, as we heard in the previous days. So there are new fields that can be explored by new organizations or by existing organizations with a capacity of learning and of reading signs, of reading needs in a quicker, in a faster way. In the family of social and solidarity economy, this being beyond marginality translates into different models. Not all the focuses are the same, of course, they do depend from context. We have seen a class of organizations that are more focused, concentrating on poverty reduction, on social inclusion, organizations reacting to social contexts that are more in need of basic inclusion policies and interventions. On the other side, in more articulated societies, for instance, in our study, we do had a focus on 8 different countries, and countries like Quebec or like Korea, Italy or Luxembourg are more on the second side, on the other side of this analysis, because they are more developing the entrepreneurial model, taking risks as businesses, trying to change the way and the form of doing business in this society. So not just addressing the goal of reducing poverty, but trying to change the mechanism of doing economy in society. And according to this mechanism, proposing also a different view in the way society is run in social political terms. So a broader ambition, depending on the fact that the urgent need are already, served by a stronger welfare or a stronger public institution offering. Another element that we want to stress is the relationship between ecosystem and financial sources. Is the quality of the ecosystem determining the articulation and the effectiveness of the financial system? What we saw in our research is that the less the ecosystem is developed, it means less relationships, less subjects, less interaction, less population within the ecosystem. The more it's difficult in developing autonomous, independent, innovative instruments, because you have not, the basic figures, the numbers, in order to satisfy need for financial instruments that are adapted to those organizations. So working on the ecosystem as a consequence, and reaching also the opportunity that you have in order to explore different ways of funding your organizations. The two things are strongly intertwined. Ecosystem, of course, means they are a strange animal. In our history, for instance, in Italy, we could never affirm that ecosystem is something that has been drawn by a legislative act. An ecosystem is a bottom-up creation, something that reflects the level of the organization and the interaction among the organization. So the ecosystem is the picture of a living experience made by different actors. And then at a certain point, this can be transformed into a legal framework. You can have a kind of dialectic interaction between the bottom-up push coming from the real experience of real actors and the freezing of the rules made by the law when the conditions are mature. I mentioned here the case that was already mentioned by Carlo Borzaga in the first keynote of the history of social cooperation in Italy that started as a natural, spontaneous reaction to new needs from bottom up in the 70s and was framed in a legislation 20 years after. So this gives you an idea of the kind of a dialectic relationship that you have between law, legal framework, and the action taking the needs as a starting point. So the power of endogenous, so the power of the elements coming from the grassroots is another element conditioning the choices and the strength of the single financial instruments. More on that is about the consideration that the social and solidarity economy should be more risky organization from the point of view of financial investors. And this is true if you are a financial investor that can measure just financial return, of course. So here the theme is the way of measuring success of the activities of those organizations. They are not more risky than ordinary organizations. In some cases, they are more stable. They are alive much longer. They can rely on more assets. So it's exactly the opposite. But nevertheless, they are conceived, they are perceived by the financial community as more risky. So that's why the world of social and solidarity economy has developed their own resources from inside, from the internal, against the mainstream finance. Because there was a misalignment, a cultural misalignment between the traditional finance and the way that risk is perceived by those organizations. The effect of this is that when we have analyzed the 8 countries and the social and solidarity economy organizations within those countries, we discovered that most of the instruments, financial instruments used in the reality, so used by those organizations right now, are very traditional instruments, like internal funding, members' fee, access to the credit guaranteed by the capital, the asset, the material assets. Nothing to do with the new instruments that are perceived as more far from principles, values, and dynamics of this world. The capacity of creating revenues, so creating a lively economic activities, is one of the most effective instruments in terms of funding of those organizations, especially the cooperative movement, as in delivering goods and services, the main instrument for its own way to finance.
Gianluca?
Yeah. So I will conclude saying that our analysis was influenced by an attitude, a mistrust attitude of the of many SSE actors against the innovation in finance. Fund impact investing is of course today one of the most discussed themes. But impact investing has to do also with impact measurement, and we know that this measurement is quite a controversial subject. It's something that we still need to see as a key element for the development of those organizations. But in in this, I mean, confronting what is happening in the impact investing world, we have to be aware that the sustainable finance movement is going on even against the needs of the social and solidarity economy. What I mean is that this emphasis on the impact finance is an emphasis that satisfies a need that comes from the necessity of the financial community to position itself in a new context where you need to demonstrate your capacity to be good and make good for the society. It doesn't imply that this surge of available capital will benefit the social and solidarity economy. So, concluding and looking forward, we are in the middle of a contradictory phase. From one side, we do have organizations that are demanded of having more activities in new domains, in new fields. And for this, they need new instruments, new financial instruments. In the past, the kind of instruments that they have used, the traditional one, were very effective. But today, I mean, the pace of addressing the finance in that way is no more sufficient in order to answer to the new needs. But the new instruments are instruments that are designed according to different principles and different values, not taking into account the real needs of these organizations. So we have to grow this movement of these organizations, have to grow, have to find new kind of resources. They cannot use fully the new instruments. They have to, in a way, reinvent with a mixed source approach, reinvent what they did in the past. They have to reinvent the ability to find the internal resources in order to grow with a pace that is coherent with their own principles and values. So these were the main findings of our research, and we, of course, are open to discuss them in the session after. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Gianluca. Three things I would say expressed by Gianluca. One is about the needs of SSE organization, enterprise are no different from the needs of the traditional enterprises. Then the link between the timing, the development phases of the SSE enterprises, and the relation of the timing with the different kind of financial mechanism. And finally, well, the presentation has been very rich with many inputs, but I remain with these two, and another one is about the importance of ecosystems. Less developed ecosystem means more problems in adapt the financial mechanism to the needs of social enterprises. Well, next speaker, I invite Professor Michael Roy. Michael, come, please. Michael is Professor of Economic Sociology and Social Policy at the Glasgow Caledonian University, UK. His work is mainly in assessing health and well-being impact of SSE in general, and he has been just appointed Editor-in-Chief of Social Enterprise Journal. His presentation, if I understand correct, will be more focused on innovative financial mechanisms. The floor is yours, Michael.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to come today to speak, and thank you, Roberto, thank you, Gianluca, for setting up my presentation so well. I'm going to drill down into one specific example of an innovative form of a financial instrument that has already been mentioned a number of times over the course of the conference. I'll try to speak slowly, And even if English is your first language, you may want to tune into the English translation, because no doubt the translators will cope brilliantly with my Glasgow accent. But I'll do my best, okay? Okay, I'm going to talk today about social impact bonds, and a bit about what is a social impact bond, because frankly it means different things in different places, but generally speaking I'll go with the traditional, what it started off as, a brief history of where they've come from, a bit of the rationale for why they exist, various critiques that have emerged over the last 7 or 8 years, and whether or not it's suitable or not for financing the social and solidarity economy. Now, this draws on the work of not just myself, but my colleagues as well. So I should recognise my colleague Neil McHugh and Stephen Sinclair as well. But there's a variety of papers on this topic, critiquing social impact bonds that go back to at least 2012, 2013. Okay, so what is a social impact bond? And apologies for the busyness of this slide. Well, first of all, in theory, it's a form of what we call payment by results, where the public and social services are outsourced, and the payment to those who are providing the services are made on achievement of various outcomes that are determined a priori. It, at least in theory, is meant to lever private investment to fund innovative, public services. But it is an investment, it's not a grant or donation. Okay, so it is very much around paying for something with the intention of getting something back. So it's not philanthropy, it's not a grant, etc. The investor, again in theory, receives a return and a dividend if the various outcomes are met. And these outcomes are different for each social impact bond, depending on, of course, the policy topic that's spoken about, etc., what they're designed to do. And indeed, the rate of return varies in terms of relation of outcomes. So, for example, if you really exceed your outcome, you'll likely receive a higher return than only if you did a moderate, or indeed didn't meet your outcome at all. You would expect to lose your money. Yeah, indeed, you lose your investment if the outcomes are not met. So this is a strange kind of bond. In fact, it's not a bond really at all. It's more like an equity product. The dividend is funded from putative future savings, again in theory, and it involves a very rather complex multi-stakeholder relationship, usually involving government, intermediaries, investors, and service providers. So here's a nice diagram that looks like a cartoon to make it more fun, but it's not really that fun at all. It involves private investors, the government, service providers, a social impact bond issuing organisation, and you see there are various flows of investment or capital between the different hands that are involved there, involving both private money and indeed public money there. So a brief history of social impact bonds. Payment by results was actually introduced by, believe it or not, a supposedly left-of-centre government in 2009 as part of the Flexible New Deal employment activation programmes. These were put in place to deliver savings and generate new resources. Now, this is known as payment for success in the US, payment for benefits in Australia, but effectively it's the same sort of principle. However, then the 2008 financial crisis came along and changed everything, effectively. So this idea has been kicking around Whitehall, actually, for a number of years prior to they actually was put in place. So effectively, it's what I call here a solution looking for a problem. So when the financial crisis happened, lo and behold, it was found to be a good idea. So it was used as a focus for deficit, debt reduction, and so on. It's framed as a more efficient use of scarce public resources, and in growing interest. There was growing interest in kind of outsourcing funding, delivery ways of welfare services, a need for new funding vehicles, and indeed that social impact bonds could be framed as the answer. It's telling that this was actually launched by, in 2010, the first SIB, which was in Peterborough Prison in England. It was launched by the Justice Secretary at the time, who I remember was Ken Clarke, Justice Secretary, and he was a Tory Justice Secretary, but it was almost seamlessly went from being left of centre government to a right-wing government, and with absolutely no change at all in policy, very, very interestingly. Then the 2013 G8 summit. Now, I remember this summit. It was in, I think it was in Gleneagles in Scotland. This is David Cameron. He really pushed this whole idea. So it says here, this is from the Telegraph, that Cameron, to push G8 on finance bonds for new social investment, is throwing his weight behind these radical plans to bring private investors into public services through rapidly growing new financial products called social impact bonds. So he's really pushing this agenda. I also remember at the time he decided to recalculate the number of social enterprises that were in the UK at the time, and it went from something like say 50,000 to something like 750,000 because of the reframing of how they decided to count the number of social enterprises. So effectively most organisations in the UK suddenly became social enterprises because they had some kind of social impact. So window cleaner, for example, cleaning windows, you can see better out your windows, lo and behold you're a social enterprise. I'm kind of flippant, but that's more or less what happened. So social impact bonds at that time have spread like a virus throughout the world. So there's now 134 of them. I'm using this pejorative language, so please excuse me. I'm supposed to be a neutral, academic and all that kind of stuff. But the spread all around the world, there's 134 of them. Well, at least there was in January 2018. This is actually the Brookings Institute. They've got some very nice maps and nice breakdowns of just where this is going. The Brookings Institute is a centrist think tank in the US. And you can download a number of different maps, etc., looking at social impact bonds and how they spread around the world. You see there that there's 27 countries so far. There's 127 social impact bonds up and running at the moment, and we've now spread into something called development impact bonds. So these are SIBs in the global south that have decided to address very acute problems in areas in the global south. There's by sector, you can see the breakdown there. 45 of them are employment programs, 12 are education, social welfare programs generally, 47. Criminal justice is a common one. Well, I say common, there's only 9 of them, but it's common because you can easily count recidivism, the rate of reoffending, etc. So it's a common way to count whether or not people have reoffended or not. It's quite easy to find that out. In health programs is 19, and environment and 52 months. And the average beneficiaries of these are usually about 15,000, but in actual fact, half of them serve far fewer populations, so only 522. Half of them serve fewer than 522 people. The average upfront capital is about $3.75 million US dollars, but the sum of upfront capital, it's quite a large sum of money here. It's $370 million is usually what is used upfront. These development impact bonds that I mentioned, there's a variety of them in India, South Africa, one in Cameroon, one in Colombia, Kenya and Uganda, Mali, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and one in Peru. And various sectors there. Okay, so going back, what's the rationale for social impact bonds? Well, it's presented as a win-win-win scenario for investors, government and the public. At least that's how it's sold. So the financial risk is, in theory, transferred to investors while social services are still being provided. So that it gets the state off the hook, if you like. It's framed, however, as some kind of unideological or technical response to social problems. It's therefore had cross-party support, as I mentioned, and it focuses on delivering outcomes rather than outputs, so a supposedly black box approach. Some of the rationale is that it also stimulates innovation in delivery of public services. It's predicated on the basis that public service providers are risk averse and often stick with established practice, so this was going to, shake up the public sector and get them to do more innovative and risky things. And apparently was going to improve public performance monitoring and transparency. However, a variety of critiques have emerged. What we find here is that because social impact bonds are very complex, in practice, funders, intermediaries that commission social impact bonds are actually heavily involved in the design of the initiative in the first place. So it's quite incestuous, and there's a fair amount of conflicts of interest that potentially could emerge. I'm not suggesting any impropriety whatsoever, but when you find that the person who designed the thing in the first place is then somehow involved in the delivery and of it, it's not exactly terribly transparent. Some service providers as well have reported less flexibility in delivering the services. They've actually reported increased oversight rather than less oversight, and an increased administrative burden rather than a decreased administrative burden. There's actually little demand as well among third sector organisations, or SSE organisations if you like. These organisations are often too small in scale. The vast majority of them, as you can imagine, are fairly small. So they don't have the necessarily financial skills or systems to manage these sorts of investments or the scale of the investments. They're also very technically difficult to commission and they involve considerable transaction costs. So because they're technically difficult, there's a massive industry being set up in order to design and to facilitate the various transactions, and lawyers are making an awful lot of money. There's no evidence whatsoever of policy innovation at all. In actual fact, if you just think about it logically, if you've got if you're a financial investor, the last thing you want to do is throw your money away on anything risky. You want on a sure bet. So in actual fact, if you look at, you go back to Mariana Mazzucato's recent work, for example, by far the most innovation is done by the public sector. It's not by the private sector at all. The private sector wants to make money. It doesn't want to throw things away on a whim. And almost all of the SIBs actually had a very relatively strong base of evidence behind them, so they weren't doing anything that was really terribly innovative at all. Plus you need to kind of sustain them to have to justify long-term savings. So basically they exemplify a kind of technocratic and supposedly depoliticised approach to policy, government roles to commission interventions. They represent a commodification of public services and further the financialisation of everyday life. So effectively you're introducing markets and financialisation of people, of land, etc. Actually furthering the whole commodification agenda, if you like. So the market principles, transaction mechanisms are penetrating what we call non-economic spheres. Social relationships are monetised. It transforms service users even into what we call fictitious commodities, if anyone knows their Polanyi. Service users are reclassified as customers. We don't have consumer sovereignty. There's little market choice at all. Minimum purchasing power. Citizens' welfare entitlements are transformed into contracts between stakeholders. And indeed, the qualitative character of services is fundamentally altered, because now it's a market relationship. It's not a relationship between society and the state. It's a society between some kind of market-based service provider. Service users then are classified as an externality in a transaction between principal stakeholders. This is my last slide, okay? So I'm just wrapping up here. So are social impact bonds suitable for financing the social and solidarity economy? Well, social impact bonds have been rolled out without any consideration at all, actually, for service users and citizens. That's not what they're for. They're actually a financial instrument. They're there to service the financial sector. They're accountable to funders. They're not accountable to service users. Genuine social innovation should enhance the capacity of service users, in my opinion. So alternative participatory approach to policy development is needed. There's actually no empirical basis at all for their proliferation. The enthusiasm is actually completely ideological in basis. So but tell you what, it's a really excellent marketing success. So rather than a substantive issue, it's actually rolled out it's been a terrific, one thing that David Cameron was really good at was marketing the whole issue. And it's an archetypal solution looking for a problem. So it exemplifies this kind of dominance of commodification, financialization into everyday life. But there is, however, a need to reclaim spheres of life which lie beyond the scope of the market and challenge the hegemony of market principles and perhaps rehumanize the social policy. But I suppose that's why there's been such a visceral reaction to them, particularly in areas such as Quebec, because they're completely inconsistent with the values of the SSE that Gianluca very cogently outlined earlier. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. A special thank for Michael for speaking slowly. I can't imagine when you speak quickly. Well, it's very interesting, the perspective from a professor of economic sociology, no? And very interesting the structure of the presentation, presenting all the facts that are around the social impact bond, but then really we remain with the idea of something that is not working as expected. Well, third speaker here, I am very pleased to invite Craig Churchill to come here. Craig has 20 years of experience in social finance. He is the chief of the social finance program at the ILO in Geneva, and he wrote many articles, books, training materials on this topic. Craig, Chair.
Great. Thanks, Roberto. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to sort of go back to Giancarlo's presentation and sort of pick up a piece of that and dive into a bit more detail. So this is the structure I want to cover quite briefly. Why is there a funding challenge for social enterprises? Life cycle of social enterprises, funding options for different stages of development, and then some policy recommendations. So I'm purposely talking about the piece of the SSE that doesn't include the solidarity bits. Right? So this is the social enterprises without the cooperatives, without the mutuals. And the logic here is that that segment of the social and solidarity economy actually has pretty cool systems that it's set up for itself. It's created its parallel financing structures. Cooperatives have created cooperative banks, or they've created credit unions, and that those credit unions have aggregated and federated into federations of credit unions. They've often, in many places, created their own insurance companies. So they've created a whole parallel financial system for the cooperative sector, which it's beautiful when it works wonderfully. It doesn't often work wonderfully, but I think where it's working, it's brilliant to behold. And I think that's a model that we should really be sort of keeping in mind. How do we enhance that? How do we make it more effective in places where it's not working well? And how do we build on that for segments of the market that it's not working for? So that's why I want to talk about the social enterprises themselves. The other piece where they're not so well organized and they're not federated and they don't have systems and processes that is catering to their particular needs. So starting at the demand side, why is there a funding challenge for this segment of the market? Well, first, for all startups, it's a challenge getting financing, so it's natural for businesses that are just getting started. I'd say there's possible capacity constraints from the entrepreneur side. that they may not have the tools or the resources to be able to provide financiers with the information that they need to make good lending decisions or investment decisions. And then as new business models, these approaches are untested and may take time to reach profitability. So this is one of the challenges that social enterprises are facing. Getting started with a new approach, we need to have a track record often to be able to access financing. And then the last point on the demand side is very particular to this market segment, which is there may be ethical challenges in pricing for viability. That because they are contributing to social outcomes, because the social nature of their enterprise, they may not be able to price their services high enough to be able to create an attractive business model. So this is one of the interesting dilemmas that social enterprises have is, how much can we charge? So the challenges are perhaps even bigger on the supply side. And I think Jean-Carl has talked about them a bit already, but perception from funders that social enterprises are not profitable. So this is a perception that it may not be true, but this is certainly something that's rooted in the financial sector that's there. Another dimension is that society assumes that the social economy should be the subsidized economy, in which case that reflects on the lender or the investor's perspective and influences the way they view this potential, say, target group. Many social enterprises are subsidized, which could have the negative impact of driving away private capital. Funders do not know how to assess the double or even the triple bottom line of performance, and people keep talking about the impact side, and it's important that we keep talking about it, because if we're positioning social enterprises as sort of contributing to social outcomes, and that's part of the attractive feature of them, that should be financed in a way that makes sense for the businesses, but also makes sense for the funders who have who ideally have who can prioritize that social dimension. But most funders do not seek this similar balance, creating a social finance return gap with, say, the traditional financing sectors. So as Giancarlo mentioned, that different stages of enterprise development require different interventions. And so he sort of articulated this already, but you can go through, you can see how social enterprises evolve. And they don't necessarily have to get to growth. Growth may not be the ultimate objective. It may be that enterprises can stay, at a medium size and continue to achieve their stated objectives, but sort of recognizing that they go through different stages then leads into, well, what does the financing needs at those different stages? So one of the things that people say in the microcredit field think about is, well, let's give loans to people because that's going to help those businesses to grow. And I'd say there's some flaws in the perspective, because in fact you don't want to give a loan to a startup necessarily. You want to be able to make sure that that business is able to repay the loan, so that there is a funding stream in place that can repay the loan. If you give a loan to a business that doesn't have a funding stream to repay the loan, then you're putting them in a disadvantage. You're causing more problems than you're solving. So we shouldn't be thinking that throwing credit at the problem is going to solve the problem. We need to think about what stage of development the business is and what its needs are at those stages. And certainly the beginning, at the idea stage or even the startup stage, thinking around grants as a better source. And grant here, I mean, it could be contribution from friends or family. It could be a crowdfunding type solution, which would be interesting to talk about whether people have any experiences with crowdfunding, because I think it lends itself very nicely to the social enterprises. And so is there things that we can do to stimulate crowdfunding for social enterprises? Could be a really interesting conversation to be having. Sort of social enterprise business competitions is another way of getting some startup capital into businesses that aren't loans. And then even as we move into sort of the startup phase, we're still not talking about debt yet. We really want them to start to generate some cash flow before we start thinking about making them repay a loan. The venture philanthropy is a really interesting model as well, where sort of venture capitalists are looking for interesting ideas that generate a social return as well as a financial return. And so they're more flexible and more willing to not require financing returns so early. So it's very patient capital. Once you do have sort of a cash flow, then we can be thinking about the credit side of things, the debt side. And here, typically you would see for social enterprises beginning more with development banks or with ethical banking rather than sort of for-profit commercial banks. And the logic there is that they have a higher alignment. The development bank or an ethical bank may be more interested in the social outcomes than the commercial banks, and sort of be more willing to work with the enterprise to be able to meet its financing needs. The logic of why maybe we want to get to the commercial banks eventually is that there's a limit to, say, at least from the development bank's perspective, how much resources they have available. And so if their limited resources should be targeted to those enterprises, social enterprises in this case, that need those resources the most. And so if I've gotten to the point where I can be weaned off of sort of government lending models to commercial models, even as a social enterprise, I think that's a graduation success that we should applaud, and that allows sort of more subsidized capital to be made available to those enterprises that need it the most. So that's sort of model of thinking about how the different financing tools are necessary at different stages of development. I want to wrap up with some sort of key recommendations that I think are useful takeaways and should be considered when we're thinking about public policy environments. First is that while we're talking about financing, it's really only one constraint. And it may not even be the most important constraint. And so it's really critical that we think more holistically about the needs of social enterprises and to make sure we have a more comprehensive package. And so it's one thing to talk about the financing piece, but we need to talk about it maybe in the ecosystem. Maybe that's the message that Giancarlo has been saying all along. There's a role for government financing, including grants and concessionary loans. And I think that's a really important piece of the conversation. We need to get governments on board in this conversation. I think, because the cooperative sector has their own systems, we need to think about how can we create a similar set of systems, financial systems, for social enterprises that don't have a cooperative model. And it may be that coming at it from a development bank angle is the right approach, or maybe there's a whole new sort of line of ethical banking that we should be advocating for and promoting. And that would be one of the areas that I think would be a very interesting conversation to be having. But for the government to get engaged, they need to make sure that they have the right tools and resources. They need to have a way of identifying whether somebody really is a social enterprise. And so the whole conversation around sort of licensing or registering companies as social enterprises is important for a lot of different reasons, but if it's particularly important if you're going to have concessionary funding from the governments to say who's eligible. Well, you've got somebody who said, okay, you're eligible because you've gotten registered as a social enterprise. Another sort of key takeaway is that any windows for grants need to be very separate from windows for loans. What you don't want to do is to get the business to sort of think that I'm going to be able to get a grant here and I'm also going to get a loan, and the loan has the same sort of characteristics as a grant. Now that may seem silly, that of course a grant and a loan are very separate, but if people get a loan from the same place that they get a grant, they may wonder why I have to repay this bit, but I don't have to repay that other bit. And so sort of having very clear delineation between grants and loans is a really important characteristic. To serve this market, development banks need to have the right skill set. They really need to have the ability to value this double bottom line. And then really thinking about this idea of graduating successful social enterprises off of the subsidized resources into commercial resources where it's possible. And I don't want to push that too hard because, I don't want to then set them up for failure because the banks have a different agenda. But I do want to make sure that the limited availability of subsidized resources gets channeled to those who need it the most. And so if I am a thriving business and I'm doing well, then I can sort of be weaned off of the subsidized capital. And then lastly, innovations like guarantee funds and blended finance can be designed to facilitate this transition. So the logic is that perhaps I can use a guarantee fund as a way of encouraging banks to lend to social enterprises by being able to take some of the risk involved in lending to them. So this is a way of sort of creating a bridge, facilitating a transition from subsidized capital to commercial capital. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention and look forward to questions and conversations.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much. I think that Greg is stay with us, and I invite also Gianluca and Michael to come here. Craig gave us some very interesting inputs, highlighting a different aspect. No? I will stress the fact that social enterprise are perceived as not profitable, and social economy is perceived as a subsidized economy. I think that these are two aspects that we need to work in this era of social media. The perception more and more important than facts, so we need to work on this. I think that we are here for questions to the panelists. 3 questions. I've been informed that 3 questions are allowed.
3 questions.
Leo.
Okay, so maybe I'll go there because...
Karin.
So 1 question.
And David.
Okay. You want to?
Well, thanks very much. It's very inspiring to see all the input, and I get to speak in a little bit about social impact bonds, but I feel overwhelmed by your analysis. So thanks very much for that, and for getting people up to speed on the later session. For me, especially Michael Roy, I mean, very positive analysis, of course, of social impact bonds and social finance. I was wondering, you see a lot of critique for SIPs, but I see a lot of the critique also in general when there's not a SIP involved. So you see a lot of troubles with the government, too little money. So it would be an interesting idea to say, okay, government will only pay if there's real results. And this part, I think, is a little under, hasn't been, I would love to hear some more from you guys about this, because what I see is a lot of waste in governments because they're not focused on the results, or they're only focused on direct results, but it's mainly subsidizing, it's grants, do your best, send us your own report on how well you do, and then all is fine, and we can all sleep, and it's all a wonderful world. So my question is, for me, social impact bonds are a way to get governments to become more result-oriented, more impact-oriented, and really measure the results. So I think that's a great way of doing, but maybe there's better ways than social impact bonds to get governments to do this. So do you agree this is a good route? And what would be the right route if SIPs are not the way?
Thank you, Leo. I will collect the other questions.
Yep.
Karin, please.
And okay, we'll give to Karin and then to...
Morning, everybody, and thank you for a very frank finance intense discussion. It's a real pleasure to hear so many different dimensions to this very tricky conversation. I'd appreciate the thoughts from the panel. In the South African context, we've just had some really interesting insights in that we're seeing high banking, so there's a higher degree of access to finances that we hadn't anticipated. But the real barrier that we're experiencing is probably in sophistication. That funding is sitting in urban areas, but we're struggling to get access to finance into rural communities. So the barrier for us then is not so much how do we focus on amounts of money. We've got agreement that new finance mechanisms are needed, but the big question I still have is how do we get money or funding or financing from the city structures out into very rural community structures? And I'd appreciate the panel's thoughts on that, please.
Thank you, Karen. Alessia?
Yes.
No, it is Daniel.
Where is, sorry?
David, sorry.
Okay.
I just wanted, I was one of a number of people involved, I'll do this really quickly, in the formation of a different kind of bank which involves a not-for-profit company whose shareholders are not-for-profit organisations. I've been the chair of that for 21 years, 19 years, and it formed a joint venture with a bank to use its financial services licence in a very, very, very tight prudential regulatory environment that just gets tighter and tighter. It has 18,000 customers that are not-for-profit organisations, and it's in the process of setting up a pool of funds from its own profits, which won't be subject to the same kind of regulatory vigour in terms of lending and credit policy and so on. But I just want, so it can be done. I think there's a trap that is pervading this conference a bit, and I think it's wonderful, but we're talking about them. And I think it would be a very good idea to have a gathering of the people we're talking about, the people that are running these things, to find out what they think. And there's a really big question, been around for years. The sectors, it's not just one, the sectors are not rapacious capitalists on one hand, and they're not mendicant, begging, give me a grant people on the other hand. And so there's an identity question in there. Okay. But I think it's really important that we also think about questions like the capacity of the people involved in this stuff to understand the financial options available to them, how to leverage the assets they have, and so on. So there's a financial literacy question, financial capability question that needs a bit of attention. I could go on at great length.
Thank you. Exceptionally, last question.
We can take just a couple of questions more, but I just ask you please to go straight to the question.
But very short.
Okay.
Donc je suis Philippe Chénaud du réseau Rêve. Deux remarques. La première, dans ma région, dans le sud de la France, on a créé un outil financier, au départ plus d'1 million d'euros avec de l'argent public, beaucoup d'argent public et un peu d'argent privé. Et on a prêté à des structures de l'économie sociale et solidaire. Et on a eu un taux de remboursement qui a dépassé les 97%. Discussion avec des banquiers privés qui co-géraient d'ailleurs aussi cette organisation, qui nous disaient mais comment vous faites pour avoir un tel taux de remboursement sur des projets, on va dire, hasardeux, avec des gens qui n'avaient pas de fonds propres, où il n'y avait pas d'hypothèque. Disant, nous, banques privées classiques, on n'y arrive pas. Et la réponse n'est pas trop compliquée. La réponse, c'est d'abord de l'accompagnement. C'est-à-dire qu'effectivement, on ne se contentait pas de prêter de l'argent. Dès le début, on travaillait sur le projet et on l'accompagnait au moins... Enfin, tous les mois, on avait une rencontre avec les porteurs de projets. Quoi. Donc un accompagnement fort. Et ma deuxième... donc ce que je veux dire, c'est que l'économie sociale et solidaire...
En question, s'il vous plaît. Parce que
et ma deuxième réflexion, c'était... je trouve qu'on caricature beaucoup. L'économie sociale, ce n'est pas que la subvention. Il faut regarder les entreprises classiques bénéficient aussi, surtout les grandes entreprises, de beaucoup de subventions.
Very quickly, if we can have one question.
No,
just-
one question is just one question for Il-chung behind. I'm sorry, but very short, Il-chung, please.
I wonder whether you have found any good practice of social financing which can measure the kind of values and principles guiding social and solidarity economy, such as solidarity, cooperation, equity, and self-democratic management. Because all those social financings are measuring the impact with the specific social and environmental objectives. But if those organizations lose those practical and organizational values, like those 4 values, I mean, what is worth having that kind of financing for social and solidarity economy?
Okay, we will now give the floor to the panelists, and then we will see if we have time. I will start with Michael. I don't know.
Hi there. Obviously, I'll focus on the response to the question there about social impact bonds. What I think, and this cuts across a lot of the questions here, is that we really need to kind of surface the ideological underpinnings of much of the statements that you said there. For example, you said that there's lots of government waste. I see lots of public sector waste as well. Private sector waste. There's no government money. Well, there's lots of government money to fund bombs, to fund, to fund X, Y, and Z. So we always go, well, public sector doesn't have much money these days. That's an ideological, that's a choice. That's a small government choice. Okay, now I know that we need to live in an environment where we're living with the reality of that, but to say that there's no government money around is frankly untrue. And but what we're seeing here is the government deciding that this part over here doesn't get so much money as this part over here. And therefore, this part over here needs to, scrabble around for the scraps that are falling off the table, whereas this one is in largesse. You say that the good way of counting outcomes, the public sector is great at counting outcomes, etc. Really great at counting outcomes. It doesn't do it terribly well, however. But going back to the way that social impact bonds are set up, they say this black box approach, for example. And then we need to think about the moral and ethical underpinnings of focusing just on outcomes. So we're saying here, we don't care how these things are done, as long as they achieve these outcomes. Well, for example, in an example where we are focusing on people to prevent recidivism, for example, is it okay to pay people not to reoffend, for example? That might be a terrifically successful way of stopping people from reoffending, just to give them money.
You have to invite the interpreters for something then. It's a special effort. Thank you, Michael. Craig?
So on that last question about examples, I mean, I think we just heard 2 interventions, one from France and one from Australia, that they've got some alternative banking models, which I think we need to do a better job of documenting their experiences and seeing how we can replicate them, because obviously there's some successes out there that needs to be well promoted so that we can see how other countries can adopt successful schemes like these. So I'm very happy to hear about both of those examples. I agree, though, that one of the challenges, as David mentioned, is that the social entrepreneurs may not know how to take advantage of the financial services as best they could, which is why back to the more holistic intervention, which includes financial literacy, but also leakages and so forth. And in terms of Karen's question about rural, this is where I think some of the government tools like guarantee funds, for example, might be useful to be able to say that, here's a line of credit that if you use that line of credit in these geographic areas, we'll underwrite part of the risk. So it's seeing how you can, create incentives for financiers to move into either sectors or geographies that they're not otherwise interested in. So what can we create as incentives for them to do that?
Thank you. Gianluca?
Yeah, me too. I'm not against, social impact bond, but I think that today there is a hype giving to this kind of instrument a role that is excessive. The point is that cannot be the instrument, is one of the instrument, can be applied under specific conditions, being able to evaluate the results can be easy in some cases, but it's absolutely difficult in other when the consequences will be measured in decades. So we should not simplify what is complex. And to me, the point, the focus should be that we have not to talk about finance for SSE, but we should talk about finance by SSE, because our research showed that this is more effective. All the instruments that are created by the organizations are more suitable for their needs. And for instance, giving examples, here we are in a place where the rural banks, we do call the cooperative banks casse rurali, rural banks. The rural banks gave to small farmers, poor farmers, instruments in order to gather and to invest in bigger projects. And from step to step, they have created a large organization serving the city and serving the territory, but starting from the local. Guarantee funds have been mentioned as an instrument. I do underline that in many cases they're not funded by the public, but they are funded by the social and solidarity economic organization themselves. We do have, for instance, in Italy a fund, national fund, that is filled by the cooperatives with the 3% of their profit every year. And with this fund, specific operations, the launch of new startups in the cooperative world, training, research are supported. And this is within the system, with no money, no public money. Fiducie in Quebec is another example of this kind of finance by SSE. Because in the package of the finance for SSE, we find instruments that are not suitable. And there is again the hype of organizations that today are trying to extract value from the social and solidarity economy. When I listen to Larry Fink saying that all investments supported by BlackRock should be responsible, I doubt that we are speaking about the same thing. So that's the point. We should be clear on the different approaches.
Thank you very much. One more question. The winner is Ben Quiñones from Philippines.
Thank you. I just want to put in the perspective from Asia, because really the problem or the goal is to source funds to finance SSEs. And I remember how Professor Yunus did it, because we were part of the process of preparing for Microcredit Summit in 1997. Prior to that, 1996, Dato Denison and I organized a summit, and there, Muhammad Yunus said, our target until 2005 is 100 million clients of microfinance. At that point in time, microfinance was only targeting 3.54 million, much of which were Grameen Bank. I was working for an institution that replicated Grameen Bank approach in Asia. 1997 came. How did Professor Yunus challenge the commercial banks and banking institutions? He said, our goal is 100 million clients by 2005. Then World Bank president asked him, can we do that? And Muhammad Yunus said, no, that is not your goal. That is our goal. What is your goal? So the president of World Bank was taken aback. Imagine this microfinance sector has the gumption to target 100 million, and World Bank is asking whether that is possible or not. So this is why year 2000, the consultative group to assist the poorest was organized. and then the financing came. My question is this: can we replicate that kind of experience? Maybe we can invite Muhammad Yunus, because he is also a proponent of social business. And his social business model is very much akin to what we're talking about. This is my question.
Thank you. Who want to comment? Great.
So, yes and no. I think the challenge is that when we talk about social solidarity economy, we're talking about so many different things at the same time. When you're talking about microcredit, the narrative was quite simple. You're giving a small loan to often a women's business, and she's going to invest that loan in her business, and it's going to grow, and she's going to be able to maybe create jobs, certainly put her children in school. So it's an easier story to tell. But here we're talking about so many different things, about creating jobs, about improving health. There's just so many different dimensions to the social solidarity economy that I think it's harder to have sort of a big campaign that has a clear, it's going to really, So I don't want to put cold water on it, but what's different is the diversity of sort of activities and approaches that's going to make it harder to sell and make it so sexy. I think it's totally sexy. We just need to figure out how to package it. So that's my answer. So yes and no is the answer.
Maybe we have to simplify the narrative about SSE to be so successful as microfinance. No? So I think that we can continue with the coffee. No? Now I would like to ask you, thank you for the panelists. Thank you very much.